Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Apocalypse Now, our Bible study about the books of Daniel and Revelation and just what apocalypse means in the Christian tradition, even beyond the Bible. So, last time we were together on Zoom, we talked about the word apocalypse, what it means, and how, even though for most of us, when we hear that word, we think about catastrophic world ending realities, the word itself actually comes from the Greek word for reveal. And what it really means, if you break it down even further, is that apocalypsis, apo means back or over, calypsis means veil. And so the word reveal comes from a pulling back of the veil. And so that's what we see in these apocalypses, the apocalypse of Daniel and the apocalypse of John and other apocalypses that exist in biblical literature and in the ancient world, is that there's a vision that is eventually revealed to the person having that vision, often by either another person or some sort of angelic figure. So, before we dive into talking in more detail about Daniel, last week on Wednesday, we got together, some of us, and watched Apocalypse Later, Harold Camping versus the End of the World. And some of us had a chance to watch it on our own time. And so I want to just begin with any reflections or responses to that movie folks had and might want to bring into our conversation before we dive into Daniel. What did y'all think of that movie?
Boring.
Boring. What did you find boring about it, Fran?
I kept waiting for it to happen.
Yeah.
He built us up.
I know.
He built
Yeah,
us
it's
up. He kept building us up, and I'm thinking, well, okay. I knew it wasn't going to happen, but the road to get there was boring.
uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was a little bit tedious. I heard other people give that feedback. It was helpful for our purposes in the sense that they did a fairly deep dive into some of this biblical scholarship.
Mhm.
But yeah, after all this build up to it's coming, one more day, here it comes, and then it's just nothing happens. So yeah, thanks for that feedback, Fran.
I think they left out too much because
Say it again.
they left out too much at the
Oh,
end. I wanted to see what the people that were following him had to say, but
mm.
I guess nobody wanted to speak up, or I don't know why they didn't include that.
Right, because there were all these people who were following Harold Camping, people who had emptied their bank accounts, people who had probably sold their houses or who knows what, and made big life changes because they thought the world would end on May 21st, 2012, 2011, um, and then it didn't. Yeah, so we didn't really get to hear from them. What about other folks? What other reactions did you have to the movie?
I felt sorry for him.
Yeah.
He's hung everything on knowing exactly when the flood was, and I how could you possibly know that with any certainty? And adding 7,000 years to it's like I felt sorry that he had put that much faith in knowing something that looking in it back, we don't know when that flood was.
Right. No, it's really true, Carol. And there were a few of us when we watched it at Sue's house who were sharing kind of a similar sentiment, just feeling bad for him. Not that we necessarily wanted him to be right, but that I mean, it was just clear that by the end of the movie, he'd had that stroke. He was naming in a really clear way that he was just wrong, and and it was kind of sad to see how much he'd aged even in just a year, and he just looked frail by the end of the movie in a way.
I particularly thought it was sad that he thought that God was punishing him for the sin of, I guess, exploiting this idea and then having it fail. But, just that God would punish him for this thing. It just seemed really very sad and not exactly the God that I support.
Yeah. Oh, it's really true. There was that moment where he said, you shouldn't do this. And God tells us not to do this, but I did. And I was wrong. I sinned. Yeah. Thanks for that, Sue. Pan, I see you talking, but it looks like you're muted.
And by the same token, it was really, I was surprised that he was able to do that.
Yeah.
So to come forth with an apology is so difficult in many situations for many people. And it was so huge after all the attention lavished. So I admired him for being able to do that.
Yeah.
Of course, there was plenty of evidence that he'd been wrong. He couldn't
Yeah.
really deny that he was wrong, right?
Right.
Right.
But we got a lot of other people out there that won't say, and there's plenty of evidence.
When they're wrong. It's true. And it was interesting to see at that biblical scholarship conference how they had that panel about Harold Camping, and how one of those scholars said that it was the first time that he'd known, kind of in recorded history, when someone's prediction was so terribly wrong and they so vulnerably named that it was. I mean, he named a couple of other people who had appointed particular dates, and he said he couldn't really, there wasn't evidence that they had come out as clearly to name the fact that they were wrong. And so, one of the things that we also kind of talked about at Sue's house, and a theme that is inside this whole Bible study we're doing together, is how apocalypse is this biblical genre. Apocalypse is this way of thinking about the world. Apocalypse can be also considered a social movement of people who are gathering and galvanizing, preparing for the end of the world, but how apocalypses can happen. Just thinking about this word revelation in all kinds of ways in our personal lives too. And that in a way, what we're seeing in this movie is Harold Camping's own apocalypse, where his world crumbles and falls apart, and the truth is revealed that he made a mistake. And that's true of so many moments in our own lives when something comes and our worlds crumble and a revelation of one variety or another breaks through. And so I want to just point out a little bit more etymology, thinking about how often apocalypse and crisis are connected, right? In popular culture, in our imaginations, what have you. And interestingly, got this word apocalypse, whose etymology means reveal. The word crisis, its etymology, rooted in a Greek word too, means decide. And so when you're in a crisis, etymologically speaking, you're in a moment where you have to make a decision of some variety. It's not just that things are going terribly wrong, it's that actually, according to the word itself, you're being presented with a decision to make about how you're going to move forward, how you're going to respond, what action you'll take. And so, again, as we think about these apocalypses, the books of Daniel and Revelation, as we dive into Parable of the Sower next week, and the various things that we're describing and thinking about, a constant question we can be asking ourselves is, where is the apocalypse happening? Where is the revelation taking place? What crisis is provoking a decision in this situation? Because as we dive into the book of Daniel, we will see how so much of what's at play in this book is the reality of crisis. So let me just give you a little bit of context about the book of Daniel as we set up this conversation for today. So, firstly, Daniel is a character in the book of Daniel, and there's the book of Daniel is set in around 600 BC. And I'll talk a little bit in just a moment about how we know that. However, Daniel, according to most scholars and theologians, probably did not exist as a person. He was a biblical character who had wisdom, who had foresight, who had faith and strength. And so there were lots of stories about Daniel that talked about him in a sense of we need a character in this story to embody these qualities. We're going to name that person Daniel. In a way, I think the closest parallel, because this was a thing that happened in the ancient world all over the place. It happens with Paul and some of Paul's letters that we have. They weren't actually written by Paul. Some of those letters are disputed, but some of them we know for a fact were not written by Paul. They were written in Paul's name. So Paul kind of assumes this larger-than-life legendary character in a way where people are writing in his name. The same thing happens with Moses. The 5 books of Moses, very likely not written by Moses. However, Moses has this character of being a lawgiver, of being a listener to God, of having this close relationship with Yahweh. And so these books, these stories are compiled and recorded in Moses's voice. I think one of the closest parallels that comes to my mind, which is obviously a reflection of my own interests and generation, is Batman. Batman has this character of being a person who is committed to justice, but also has this double identity. And there's lots of different people who have taken the story of Batman and used it and tweaked it in all kinds of different ways. But we can think of all kinds of legendary characters for whom this is the case, where they get picked up, their identity gets invoked for the purposes of telling a particular kind of story. In the case of Daniel, if we dive into the book itself, we get the sense right off the bat of where and when we are, because in the very first chapter, we learn this, that in the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Okay, here is a drawing of King Jehoiakim, and King Jehoiakim was notorious in the Bible and in the Judean history for a number of reasons. It was during the reign of King Jehoiakim that the book of Jeremiah is set. And so this was a person who actually existed. There's other non-biblical documents that give evidence that he existed in the 6th century BCE. And originally he was a vassal king installed by the Egyptians, the Egyptian Empire, who had taken control of Judea. Eventually, the Babylonians and the Egyptians are at war, vying for control of this area of Judea, which if you, we'll look at a map actually in just a moment, but you can see, pull this map up right now. You can see here that this is a fairly strategic place to be. When you're on the coast, and then that gives you access to modern-day Turkey, modern-day Greece. You can go through here and get into the Mediterranean and get towards the Roman Empire and what have you. So this area where the Judean people were, where Jerusalem was incredibly important strategically if you're a world empire vying for trade routes and what have you. And so here we have in red the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and then here we have the Egyptian Empire, and then right here we have this little area right on the border is Judea and Jerusalem in particular right there. And so there was this constant battling back and forth for control of this area between the Babylonian Empire and the Egyptian Empire. King Jehoiakim's caught in the midst of all of that. So eventually, the Egyptians are defeated. The Babylonians come in, King Nebuchadnezzar comes in, and he, like the Egyptians, tells King Jehoiakim, you have to pay us if you want us to not destroy you. And so King Jehoiakim enacts this very intense tax. And at this time, Jeremiah is saying to King Jehoiakim, you need to cool it on this taxing that you're doing, and also you aren't keeping the faith. You aren't doing the right sorts of observances in a way that is pleasing to God. King Jehoiakim actually takes the scrolls that Jeremiah has circulated and cuts them in half and burns them. So that's why there's this picture here of him doing that. Then fast forward a little bit. Egyptians, Babylonians, they're still right here in this area, fighting each other. Seems like the Egyptians may win. King Jehoiakim switches allegiance, and then he bets wrong. The Babylonians come in, and they decide, because of his betrayal, they actually sack Jerusalem, destroy the temple, and this begins the period known as the Babylonian captivity. So that's what Daniel's talking about here in this first page, in this first chapter. He's talking about how King Nebuchadnezzar of the Babylonian Empire sieges Jerusalem, destroys the temple, and actually kidnaps bunches of people, including Daniel and some of his friends. His friends named Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, people that get renamed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Okay.
And so as we think about the book of Daniel, I'm going to set this up so that you get a sense of it's a story of betrayal, it's a story of empires vying for dominance, and it's a story of noble people following their faith. And in the case of Hananiah / Shadrach, Mishael / Meshach, and Azariah / Abednego, this is a very popular Sunday school story, so maybe some of y'all are familiar with it. But for those who aren't, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refuse to worship the Babylonian gods, and so they are thrown into a pit of fire, but they do not get burned. And so here they are in this pit of fire, and you have the Babylonians looking down, wondering why they're not getting burnt up. And so what happens is that after this moment, King Nebuchadnezzar says, wow, the God of the Judeans is really powerful. This is amazing. And Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego go on about their business. So then, let's fast forward to chapter 5. And here's another very popular story that we get from the book of Daniel, the story of Belshazzar's feast. So, during the siege of Jerusalem, the Babylonians, in the process of destroying the temple, they take a bunch of stuff out of the temple. Holy cups and plates, a whole variety of sacred artifacts. And then Belshazzar, who's King Nebuchadnezzar's son, uses all of that to throw a feast. And in the midst of that feast, he sees a hand writing on the wall. Cannot interpret it though. Does not know what it says. And so he calls upon Daniel. Daniel, who at this point is already nestled deeply into the Babylonian court because he's a dream interpreter, and he can do this very well. So Belshazzar, King Nebuchadnezzar's son, calls Daniel in and basically tells Belshazzar that his reign, when he assumes the throne, will be short-lived because God will punish him for doing this, for using these temple artifacts in this blasphemous way. And he tells them that another empire will come and overthrow the Babylonian Empire, which, as it happens, is true. And so the Medo-Persian Empire eventually takes control of Judea. And during this time, some of Daniel's enemies within the temple court decide that they want to get Daniel in trouble. And so they convince King Darius, who's the new king, vassal king of this area, convinces him to pass a law that prohibits the worship of any other gods but the Persian gods. And so that leads to Daniel having to make a choice. Is he going to continue to worship Yahweh, even though it's prohibited, or will he stop? Daniel, of course, decides to continue worshiping Yahweh, and then he's thrown into a pit of lions. So here's another story that maybe many of us were taught in Sunday school about Daniel being thrown into the den of lions and not being hurt at all. So, what we see from chapters 1 to 6 are really stories again of exile, stories of forced assimilation, stories of people having to make the choice between following their faith or going along with what the people in power say to do. And at every turn in these stories, what you see are the Judeans deciding to continue to worship the God of Israel and surviving the terrible atrocities that the Babylonians and then the Persians are trying to enact. Now, another interesting difference between these chapters and the visions that we're going to talk about in just a minute is language. So the book of Daniel is actually not only in Hebrew, but is also in Aramaic. And so this leads folks to believe that, again, this is a collection of stories that have been compiled and edited to be a single narrative. But what you see is that it's really chapters 1 is in Hebrew, and then chapters 2 through 7 are in Aramaic, and then the following chapters are in Hebrew again. So what folks think may have happened was that you've had these Aramaic stories that then later a Hebrew author edits and kind of puts a preface and then puts some ending to. So that's one theory as to how we get the book of Daniel. Any questions or comments about that section in these stories at this point? Okay, well, let's get into the weird stuff then. So, in chapter 7, that's when we see the beginning of these visions. But before we get there, let's just read how the author, the editors, depending on your perspective, put these stories together. So here's the end of chapter 6. This is the chapter where Daniel's been thrown into the lion's den. So, here's what it says. Can y'all see this? Okay. Then King Darius wrote to all peoples and nations of every language throughout the whole world, may you have abundant prosperity. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people should tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, because I threw him into a pit of lions and he was not eaten. For that God is the living God, enduring forever. That God's kingdom shall never be destroyed, and that God's dominion has no end. God delivers and rescues, works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, for God has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So that's the final. Oh, actually, no, we've got one more little section here of chapter 6. Yes, so that's not here right there. The last little part of chapter 6 reads in verse 28, so this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So that's the end of chapter 6. Here's the beginning of chapter 7. In the first year of King Belshazzar of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head as he lay in bed. Then he wrote down the dream. I, Daniel, saw in my vision by night the 4 winds of heaven stirring up the great sea, and 4 great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. So what we're seeing here then is this going back. Remember, by the end of chapter 6, King Belshazzar has already been overthrown. But in the beginning of chapter 7, we're getting a different timeline started. Now we're back in Belshazzar's reign, and we're also seeing a change in genre. So before we were in the world of a third-person account. It was he's, hers, she, it, third-person pronouns. Now we're in the realm of I, first-person account. So we have a shift moving from, again, these stories about somebody else told from a third-person perspective to what is essentially a series of journal entries where I, Daniel, am recording my dreams and these visions that I had. So let's read a little bit about what it says. The first vision, the first beast that came from the sea was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Lion with eagle's wings. Then as I watched, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a human being, and a human mind was given to it. Another beast appeared, a second one that looked like a bear. It was raised up on one side, had 3 tusks in its mouth among its teeth, and was told, arise, devour many bodies. After this, as I watched, another appeared, like a leopard. The beast had 4 wings of a bird on its back, and 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this, I saw in the visions by night a 4th beast. It had great iron teeth and was devouring, breaking in pieces and stamping what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that preceded it, and it had 10 horns. I was considering the horns when another horn appeared, a little one, coming up among them to make room for it. 3 of the earlier horns were plucked up by the roots. Okay. So this is the beginning of this apocalyptic vision with these 4 beasts coming out of the ocean and just weird stuff's happening to them. They look strange. They're composites of different kinds of animals. They have multiple heads in some cases. They have multiple horns in some cases. Okay, so then after this description of these beasts, here's what happens next. As I watched, thrones were set in place, and an ancient one took his throne. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, and its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and flowed out from his presence. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood attending him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. I watched then, because of the noise of the arrogant words that the horn was speaking. Remember, of the 10-horned beast, that fourth beast, 3 horns get plucked out for another horn to emerge, and that horn had eyes and a mouth and was speaking. And as I watched, the beast was put to death, and its body destroyed, and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. All right, let's pause here for a minute. What reactions do you have, if any, hearing that, reading that? What jumps out at you? And if the response is simply being baffled, that's entirely appropriate.
My question is, who did the drawing? What author, what painter was that? Did you know, or?
Yeah, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he was an 18th century Italian etching artist. So that's an etching that he did. But there's all kinds as you can imagine, particularly for people in a world before there was Netflix, this kind of description was probably a delight for lots of painters, right, and artists to try to recreate. And they had permission to do it because it's in the Bible. I'm not just making weird stuff up. This is in the Bible. And so these stories, to their audience even, as they are to us, were baffling and exciting and exhilarating. Imagining these things thrilled people in the ancient world, and have for centuries.
I just kept reflecting. I did something on Sunday after church. I went out to the mosque, and they had an open house.
Mm-hmm.
And I ended up sitting afterwards with a young 20-year-old, beautiful young woman from Bellevue Baptist. And in our conversation, she believes that the scripture is the inerrant word of God, every word of it.
Yeah.
And I just kept thinking, how does one take in that these were actual things? And where does this, without enormous scholarship and historical understanding, thank you so much. I just was in awe of my total ignorance, first of all. And secondly, just listening to her and trying to sort in my mind so many people that I have come across that believe every word. That's where I'm resting with this right now.
I appreciate you naming that, Pan, because it's, it goes right to the heart of our discussion, contemporarily speaking, about the apocalypse, about the end of the world. Because this book, as I mentioned at the beginning, was set in 600 BC. However, let me pause. It's set in 600 BC. If you're a person who reads the Bible literally, then everything that follows in this book is a prediction. It's a vision of a future. And it was a vision of a future that even people who read this book literally will say, not of our future necessarily, but of their future, because it actually predicts, if you believe it was set in 600 BC, things that happen in the ancient world, tradings of empire that happen over time, and which we'll get into in just a little bit as we talk about these 4 beasts. And there's also a moment in this book where there is someone who looks like a son of man is mentioned. And many Christians have historically and continue to reinterpret that as Jesus. That Jesus is showing up here in the Old Testament, in the book of Daniel. However, most biblical scholars believe that's actually a representation of an angel, and maybe the archangel Michael. And so some things that are interesting about the book of Daniel, in addition to these highly descriptive, this highly descriptive vision that Daniel has, in addition to that, this is the first and I believe only book in which angels are given names. We see in the Hebrew Bible, we see Gabriel and Michael. They're both named later on. And so we have suddenly the emergence of this sort of class of angels. So now we're not just talking about there being God and human beings, but now there's this sort of intermediary class of angels who have a function, who have names, who have identity and story and do things in the world. Before the book of Daniel, there were angels mentioned in different ways, but they hadn't ever played as big of a role in a piece of scripture in the Hebrew Bible before the book of Daniel. So then, how do we piece all that together? If we aren't going to read this story, this book literally, then how should we read it? Well, the angel actually in the book of Daniel does some interpreting for us, but in addition to that interpretation, the scholars have looked at various documents and pieced things together based on the fact that if Daniel was written in the 7th century BC, then it was an incredibly good prediction. Often what modern day scholars will do is that when the Bible is said to predict something, actually what more likely has happened is that you have someone writing about events that have already taken place. And so folks think it's more likely that rather than being written in 600 BC, Daniel was written in 200 BC and is actually describing events that had already taken place. And part of the reason why they believe that is there's a couple of historical inaccuracies that are clear that this was very likely written by someone who was not living during this time. For instance, King Darius, that was mentioned before at the end of chapter 6. There's no historical evidence that such a person actually existed. And if that person had existed and was a king in the Persian Empire, there would be other evidence elsewhere. And so what they think may have probably happened is that this book, written several hundred years after when it's set, just didn't know. They were mistaken about who that person was and sort of had an imagination about how the change in empire would have gone. And so even though there was this sort of popular cultural idea about this person who existed, they never actually did. It's a theory, right? There's no way for us to know for sure. It's all based on context. So here's where the conversation often goes when we're looking at the book of Daniel and trying to make sense of what this apocalypse is really revealing. So if we look at these four beasts, here's how we might understand them. Again, based on context and based on the fact that these different ways of describing these beasts actually have a lot of resonance with world history. Firstly, the first beast is the lion, right here with its wings. And many scholars believe that the lion actually represents the Empire of Babylon. And so the lion, these wings are actually a very common image that you see in a lot of Babylonian religious imagery. And the lion had a certain kind of gravitas in that culture. And so the idea is that perhaps Daniel uses the lion to indicate the Babylonian Empire. Secondly, we have the bear. And so the bear here, with its three tusks, is, according to scholars, very likely an allusion to the empire of the Medes. And this is a group of people who lived in ancient Iran, kind of alongside the Persians of this time. So Media and Persia were two cities in ancient Iran. And so they sort of eventually form a single empire known as the Persian Empire. But the idea is that the bear is very likely pointing to the Medes. The leopard here is very likely pointing to Persia. And it actually, the four heads may reflect the four different Persian kings that reigned over during the time of Judea and its captivity, its occupation by foreign forces. Then the fourth beast here, the one that Daniel describes as being separate and different and more fearsome, is likely an allusion to the Greek Empire. And the 10 different horns are meant to point to the 10 different kings of the Greek Empire. Now, there's an interesting little description about this beast in particular, and there's that moment where Daniel mentions that he saw 3 different horns plucked out, and then another horn emerging out of that beast's head that has a mouth and has eyes and starts speaking arrogantly. So, I'm going to read to you verses 23 through 28. This horn, this arrogant horn, emerges with eyes and a mouth, and verse 23 reads, "This is what he said. As for the fourth beast, there shall be a fourth kingdom on earth that shall be different from all the other kingdoms. It shall devour the whole earth and trample it down and break it to pieces. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them. This one shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings." 3 horns plucked out, this horn comes up. "He shall speak words against the Most High, shall wear out the holy ones of the Most High, and shall attempt to change the sacred seasons and the law, and they shall be given into his power for a time, 2 times, and a half time. Then the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away, to be consumed and totally destroyed." Scholars believe that this horn is pointing to a particular king. Let's see here. So here's the little arrogant horn speaking aloud. And scholars believe that it's actually pointing to this person here, Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who was a Greek king and who had taken control of Judea during this time, and was responsible for basically a full-scale assault on the customs of Judea. This king outlawed the practice of Judaism altogether and defiled the various places where the Judeans had gathered to worship. One of the most popular places where Judeans were gathering to worship, this king actually destroyed it and turned it into a temple to Zeus. And so you see here there's this mention in verse 25 that this horn shall speak words against the Most High, shall wear out the holy ones of the Most High, and shall attempt to change the sacred seasons and the law. And so scholars believe that this passage is actually referring to this person and his actions. Other evidence for this connection is that Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth was indeed the 4th king, was 4th in line in the succession of Greek emperors, and his brother and his brother's son, so his nephew, were both murdered. And then his second nephew, who would have been heir to the throne, was exiled to Rome. And so the idea is that this plucking out of those three horns refers to that historical reality. Then, in addition, his name here, this sort of second name, Epiphanes, is a shortened version of a nickname that he gave himself, which was Theos Epiphanes, which means God manifest. And so this person really did believe that he had this divine presence in the world, and that led to his arrogance in basically saying that the Jews should not worship anyone but him / the folks of his culture. And so there was this sense of forced assimilation that eventually led to a couple of different revolts. One was the Maccabean revolt, and that is actually the place where we get the story of Hanukkah. The story was that during the Maccabean revolt, under Antiochus IV, the Judeans had gathered, and they only had enough oil for one night, but it lasted for 7 nights, and that enabled them to make their way out during their revolt and escape the clutches of King Antiochus IV. Most scholars believe that the book of Daniel was actually written during the reign of Antiochus IV. And they think that because all of these different allusions point so precisely to each of these different historical events, from the succession of kings in the Greek Empire, to the succession of empires in Judea, and to the succession of the beasts in the order that they come in. Yeah, Fran.
I also have to ask a question, and that question is, it seems to me that Daniel, I know this is supposed to be a dream, but it takes me back to when the, Native American Indians would do peyote and stuff before they would go to war. I'm just wondering, was Daniel taking something to see all this stuff?
You read my
To me, it just so appeared so, like you said, weird,
Yeah.
So, I mean, in his dream, would he have been able to visualize this without having had some substance, within him?
That is a totally legitimate question, and one that I can't answer, but I will say this: it wasn't uncommon in the ancient world for oracles, for shamans, for astrologers, and other folks to use hallucinogenic substances in order to enter into a trance-like state and report what they observed. So it's possible. Now, what's also possible is that Daniel was an imaginative person, or rather the author of this book was an imaginative person who used all of these pretty tedious, in some cases, visions, right? I mean, just the description of the wings and the wings being plucked out and the 10 horns and the 3 horns being plucked out and the 1 horn emerging. It's pretty tedious, and uses all of that imagery as a way to make a political commentary on his contemporary moment. In the same way, we can think of a book like 1984 or Animal Farm or what have you, these books that are these highly imaginative narratives that are actually making commentary on contemporary events. And so that's, and whether or not George Orwell was aided by various substances, I can't say. But what we can say is that this is a tradition of using imagery and using narrative and using visions to make commentary on contemporary events. That's one way to see what this book is. Now, again, if you're a person who believes in the inerrancy of the Bible, You're not going to see it that way. You're going to see this as a prediction. You're going to see this as a prediction about a 6th century BC prediction about things that would happen later. You'll see this as a prediction of Jesus' coming. You'll see this as a prediction of a whole variety of things. However, it seems like it's just too big of a coincidence for all of these different things that even the angel itself says to Daniel. You know, these horns represent kings. The angel says this to Daniel. It seems like it would be a fairly big coincidence for the imagery that Daniel mentions here to just happen to so accurately coincide with historical events. So, but it'll be an ongoing question for us as we look at the book of Revelation. As we look even next week at Parable of the Sower, a book that was written in 1993, set in 2024, and happens to have some interesting resonances with our time. There's a political leader in that book who wants to make America great again. Now, was Octavia Butler predicting Donald Trump? Probably not. But however, what she was doing was looking at her moment and getting a sense of what the political tendencies and realities of her moment were, and just pushing them a little bit farther into the future. So, as we think about the book of Daniel and these visions, they're curious for sure. They're very layered, they're very tedious. But again, the consensus among most scholars is that they're not predicting the future, they're finding a way to describe the present. They're finding a way to make sense of a people who, as you see from the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to Daniel being tossed into the lion's den, to these visions, you see a people who have been just traded back and forth among different empires. And so that people express through the voice of Daniel a vision that describes not only what's happening, but what's going to happen. Because eventually what you find in chapter 7, verse 27, here's how it reads. The kingship and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the holy ones of the Most High. So all the kingdoms of the world are going to be given over to the Judeans. Their kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey them. So what we have, like in Revelations, is that we have a description of this people who've been oppressed by one empire or another. Eventually, remember about last week when we were, or the last time we gathered for Tuesday, where we have this ultimate evil, ultimate good, where the ultimate good wins out. We have that here in Daniel. And then lastly, in verse 28, it says, here the account ends. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly terrified me, and my face turned pale, but I kept the matter in my mind. And so we have Daniel saying, this dream freaked me out, but I'm holding it. Not only am I holding it, I wrote it down for you. So I'm going to pause in just a minute just to see what questions y'all have. But if you need to leave right at 11, I'll just say this. The next time we get together, we're going to be at Sue's house again. This will be next Wednesday at 6 p.m. And we're going to read an excerpt from the Parable of the Sower, what I just mentioned before. And no doubt we will continue this conversation about Daniel because there's some interesting parallels between the two books. So with that, I'm going to hang out for anyone who has any other thoughts or questions about Daniel as we prepare for this next leg of our conversation together. So thank you all so much. What questions, what thoughts do you have?
I want to bring it to present day, Pastor Tony, and I have to, I'm going to say this with tongue in cheek, but would you not consider the legalization of marijuana an apocalypse, how you pronounce that word? Would you not? I mean, there were people who had predicted this years ago, that this would become legal,
Hmm.
and it has. So, would you have thought that 40 years ago? Even though you had people saying that it was good for the medical, I mean, where would you put that in our present day?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Fran. As I think about the legalization of marijuana, the
Yeah,
legalization of gay marriage, or the legalization of so
yeah,
many different
yeah,
things
all these things.
that people have been working for and fighting for, and what you could do is look at documents from, let's say, 40 years ago
Yeah,
and find one that said, oh, this is going to happen at some point. Now, you could read that as this is a prediction of the future, or this is a person who's analyzing the present and just pushing what they see happening just further a little bit. But in any event, another way to think about that is that whether we're talking about the legalization of marijuana or the legalization of gay marriage, or we're talking about immigration or so many other political issues, we could be thinking to ourselves, all right, well, what do these issues reveal about who we are and where we are now? Why now did this happen?
yeah.
And in terms of making that connection with apocalyptic realities.
Well, I guess that would be the same thing with when King was Cotton. Cotton isn't king anymore. And we flipped over to the what was that? The pawning of catfish instead of cotton in Mississippi.
Mhm.
These are present, things that are happening. Who would ever thought that,
Right.
cotton would no longer be one of our products, here in the country. When
Right.
that, years ago, that was what built us.
No, it's true, Fran. And I think an interesting parallel to Daniel would be if someone were to write a vision that they had that was set 50 years ago, and they had a character that said, I predict that we will have at some point in this state, cotton will fall and will be eaten up by some big old bear or something like that, right? Where you're
Evangelical.
actually writing a contemporary, you know how the story ends, or at least where it's going, but then you set the story few decades, few hundred years in the past and talk about it in a way, to kind of to reveal something about what has happened already.
So many historic documents that can be used and misused in that way.
Mm-hmm.
I think of used maybe in the terms of women getting the vote, coming forward and how that happened. I think of misuse in terms of how are trying to rewrite the narrative behind the causes of the Civil War and what happened. I mean, in a way, there's a part of me that hopes that there is a spirit me that lives on to see how and if these come forth in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I'm fascinated by this class, Tony, because it's such an awakening as we look at people like Octavia Butler and interpretations that they give. And just say what's happening now. What are those forces work this minute that we have this privilege of living in?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and Octavia Butler will be an interesting parallel to read with Daniel, because she's a person who's writing in the past about a future that she didn't get to live. However, she's looking at her contemporary moment and saying, well, if these threads keep on going and get threaded in other threads, here's a possible vision for what reality will be at that time. So it'll be interesting for us to kind of look at that in conversation with Daniel, because like Daniel, it's also written from the first person. There's diary entries is what the book is. Kind of like Daniel when he says, I'm writing down my dream, y'all, and I don't know what it means, but here we go. So yeah, thanks for naming that, Pam. Julia, did I see your hand up?
You did. I have enjoyed the whole time remembering what you said early on about the interpretation of the word crisis to mean the choices in the moment of these terrible bad things happening.
Yeah.
And what I think I've always felt like that the Bible does in these fantastical stories, whether you believe they're real or not, is not unlike one of my favorite writers for contemporary politics is Heather Cox Richardson, who basically tells us day after day, this is not brand new stuff. This happened back in this time and this, and I think that the choice that comes to my mind is that you can listen to these stories or read these articles as, oh shit, oh no, this is going to be horrifying. Yeah. And quite frankly, for somewhere in the world right now, it is horrifying. It is apocalypse and
yes. Yes.
And or the other side of it could be is, okay, we've been here before, we know what to do, we know how to make choices. And basically Daniel's story is stories keep saying, keep your faith, whatever that is. And for us, but so it's not necessarily apocalypse of the universe and no, all is not. But that what are we going to learn from this time? How are we going to tell this? And we have TV and movies and books and all kind of wonderful ways to interpret. So I just kind of find the whole thing really fascinating and wonderful way to think about this.
Yeah, no, thanks for naming that, Julia, because it is, one way to read Daniel and this vision that we just talked about was that a person made a choice about how to make meaning of catastrophe, of decades and centuries of catastrophe, of his people, her people, being manipulated and controlled by outside forces. And so this person tells that story in such a way that uses this rich imagery, but ends with them winning. And that piece actually is the piece they didn't get right. And so that's partly how scholars have dated this, is that they imagine that King Antiochus dies in this very specific way in a particular place, which does not happen. And so scholars date this to be probably a few years before King Antiochus actually died. But just to your point, it was a decision, it was a decision to make scripture, to make literature, to make stories in order to make meaning of a reality that was very difficult.
Think of the gargoyles we could create for the modern day leaders that they can't describe with big enough words. If I were teaching a high school class right now, I'd say, okay, find your least favorite powerful person and create a monster, a beast.
Yeah.
What would their horns be doing?
No, absolutely. And in doing that, what you find is agency, at the very least. I might not be able to control all of this, but I can at least make it part of my story in a way that gives me meaning. And if I have to turn fill in the blank into a beast with a bunch of horns, or turn fill in the blank into a horn himself, I'll do it. Yeah. Thanks for that, Julia. Any other questions or thoughts, reflections?
No, one thing that comes to mind, Tony, is, all of this to me is just about imbalance. You've got the devouring beast, which is just one extreme this way, and people thinking that it does usually have to swing all the way the other way, but it's just finding that place in the middle. It just always seems to come to that.
That's an interesting way to describe this dynamic, Diane, is that we go from one extreme of domination to a whole other extreme, as a way of getting to, because what these visions always point to is peace. It's ultimately that we come to a place of peace. Often the way we get there is through a whole lot of destruction and fire and what have you, but nevertheless, the end point is calm, it's peace and harmony. Yeah.
Yeah.
Must we get there through struggle? Oh,
Yeah. In a way, I think that's the question we're all asking ourselves, particularly this year, isn't it? Is there another way that we can get to that? And because again, it's no mistake that when you go through a lot of the streaming platforms that we have right now, we talked about this, the Tuesday before last. There's so much end of the world content right now, whether it's a pandemic or a war or zombies or fill in the blank, nuclear holocaust. There's so much right now in our imaginations about the end of the world. And I think it would be interesting for us to look at Parable of the Sower next week, because it's not imagining how the world where it will end. Instead, it's imagining how do people live afterward? How do you make it? What's important? How does creativity fit into it? How does religion fit into the effort to live after the world's been turned upside down? So I look forward to chatting with y'all next week at Sue's house, if you're able to make it then. In the syllabus, in the outline, it kind of gives you a rundown of what the chapters are the sections that we're gonna read if you're not able to make it. Because you can find it on Audible, you can find it on Kindle and all of that. You can just read it on your own. I've got a copy if you need one, if you're not able to be there next Wednesday at 6. All right, y'all. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure as always.
Marjan at 12:30?
Yes, I'll be there.
Okay.
And if Joy's not coming, we'll have to play with the mini set.
Okay.
since Terry's not coming.